Dark storm clouds drift slowly across the endless deserts of the Middle East as the sound of distant fighter jets shakes the sky. Warships move silently through dark waters while heavily guarded oil tankers pass through some of the world's most dangerous maritime routes. Television screens flash breaking news alerts. Anchors speak with urgency. Military analysts point toward maps filled with red zones, missile ranges, and strategic bases. Across the globe, millions watch anxiously as tensions rise between two nations whose rivalry has shaped modern geopolitics for decades. In every major conflict, two wars are always being fought at the same time. One war takes place on battlefields with missiles, drones, soldiers, explosions, and destruction. The second war happens far away from the front lines, inside newsrooms, political speeches, social media platforms, intelligence briefings, and the minds of ordinary people. In the modern world, military power alone is no longer enough to guarantee victory. Nations also fight for global perception, public opinion, and control over the narrative. Sometimes the side that appears strongest is not necessarily the side that achieved all of its goals. And sometimes governments fear losing the image of strength more than losing territory itself. For years, the relationship between the United States and Iran evolved into one of the most dangerous and complex rivalries in the world. What began decades earlier through political tensions, revolutions, sanctions, and ideological differences slowly transformed into a massive geopolitical struggle involving military pressure, economic warfare, cyber operations, regional alliances, intelligence battles, and global diplomacy. Every incident in the Persian Gulf, every drone strike, every military exercise, and every political statement increased fears that the confrontation could eventually spiral into a much larger regional war. But behind the headlines and official statements, one important question continued to emerge among political experts, historians, military strategists, and global observers. Why would the United States avoid publicly admitting that it failed to completely achieve its objectives against Iran? Why would officials carefully choose their words even when outcomes remained uncertain or incomplete? The answer reaches far deeper than the battlefield itself. It involves the psychology of global superpowers, domestic political survival, economic stability, military credibility, alliance management, and the enormous fear of losing international influence in a rapidly changing world order. The United States spent decades building its position as the world's dominant military and political power. American influence expanded through military bases across multiple continents, powerful naval fleets, advanced technology, economic partnerships, intelligence networks, and global alliances. But American power has never depended only on bombs, aircraft carriers, or nuclear weapons. It also depends heavily on perception, the worldwide belief that the United States remains powerful enough to enforce its interests anywhere on Earth. That perception became one of America's greatest strategic assets. Many countries across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East depend on American military support and security guarantees. Allies rely on Washington for intelligence cooperation, weapons systems, economic stability, and protection against regional threats. If the United States openly admitted that it could not fully force Iran into submission despite years of pressure, sanctions, military deployments, and strategic operations, that confidence could begin to weaken across the international system. Global dominance relies heavily on deterrence. Deterrence means convincing rivals that challenging a superpower would bring unbearable consequences. It is not only about actual military strength, it is about creating fear and uncertainty inside the minds of opponents. But if a regional power like Iran manages to resist pressure, survive economic punishment, adapt strategically, and continue operating despite enormous opposition, then other nations may start questioning whether American threats still carry the same level of power they once did. The concern was never limited to Iran alone. The larger fear centered on the message such an admission could send across the world. Rival governments, armed groups, rising powers, and even American allies could interpret it as evidence that Washington's influence was slowly declining. Inside the United States itself, international conflicts are deeply connected to domestic politics. Every American president is judged by how strong or weak they appear during global crises. Political opponents closely examine every military operation, every diplomatic decision, and every televised speech. Public perception can influence elections, shape approval ratings, and determine political survival. No administration wants headlines announcing that America lost against Iran. Such a perception could seriously damage political credibility, weaken public trust, intensify internal divisions, and create enormous pressure from both supporters and critics. In American politics, appearing weak on foreign policy can become politically devastating. The memory of past wars still heavily influences American society. The Vietnam War left behind deep scars and created widespread skepticism toward military intervention overseas. Decades later, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan consumed trillions of dollars, lasted far longer than expected, and cost countless lives. Many Americans became exhausted by endless military conflicts that produced uncertain outcomes despite overwhelming military superiority. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan further intensified those concerns. Images from Kabul airport spread rapidly across global media, with critics describing the withdrawal as a humiliation for American foreign policy. Because of that experience, another widely perceived failure in the Middle East could trigger massive political backlash and further damage confidence in American leadership both domestically and internationally. As a result, governments often manage public narratives very carefully. Even when objectives remain incomplete or outcomes become uncertain, officials rarely use the language of defeat. Instead, operations are framed as strategic successes, defensive actions, deterrence missions, or efforts that degraded enemy capabilities. Political language becomes carefully engineered to preserve the appearance of control. At the same time, the conflict with Iran has always involved one of the most economically sensitive regions on Earth. Iran's geographic location gives it enormous strategic importance. Near its borders lies the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways in the world. A huge percentage of global oil shipments passes through this narrow route every single day. Even small disruptions in this area can send shockwaves through international energy markets within hours. If Iran demonstrates the ability to threaten shipping lanes, disrupt maritime traffic, or increase oil prices despite intense American military pressure, global investors and allied governments become deeply concerned. Energy prices influence transportation, manufacturing, inflation, food costs, and financial markets across the entire world economy. Modern markets operate heavily on confidence and perception. Investors react not only to actual military events but also to uncertainty, fear, and geopolitical instability. A public acknowledgement that American strategy failed to fully control the situation could create panic in energy markets, rising inflation fears, unstable stock markets, and widespread economic uncertainty. This is why the confrontation was never only about military victory. It was also about maintaining the image of strategic control and preserving confidence in the international system. Another major challenge emerged from Iran's own military strategy. Iranian leaders understood clearly that they could never defeat the United States in a conventional war involving aircraft carriers, advanced fighter jets, and direct large-scale military confrontation. Instead, Iran focused on developing asymmetric warfare capabilities designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses of stronger opponents. Asymmetric warfare avoids direct battles where a weaker side would likely lose quickly. Instead, it slowly increases the political, military, and economic costs of conflict over time. Iran invested heavily in ballistic missiles, underground military infrastructure, cyber warfare units, drones, proxy militias, regional alliances, and intelligence operations spread across multiple countries. Rather than concentrating all efforts on one traditional battlefield, Iran created numerous pressure points across the Middle East. This strategy complicated military planning enormously. Even if the United States achieved tactical success in one region, new tensions could emerge elsewhere through indirect operations and regional networks. This created one of the greatest frustrations for American strategists. Advanced military superiority could destroy targets, eliminate infrastructure, or conduct precision strikes, but it could not automatically guarantee long-term political surrender. Winning battles did not necessarily mean winning the broader strategic conflict. Behind closed doors, another issue quietly worried policymakers and military experts: the credibility trap. When a superpower repeatedly makes powerful public threats, backing away later becomes extremely risky. Strong rhetoric creates expectations both internationally and domestically. If leaders publicly promise that Iran will be stopped at all costs, but Iran survives, adapts, and continues resisting pressure, future American warnings may appear less believable. Opponents may become more willing to challenge Washington, believing that the United States cannot always achieve the outcomes it promises. Because of this, governments carefully avoid language that could imply weakness or failure. Instead of directly admitting defeat, official narratives often shift subtly over time. Objectives may quietly change. Strategic goals may be redefined. Public statements may focus on regional stability, threat reduction, or restored deterrence, rather than the original ambitions that were never fully achieved. These carefully crafted phrases allow governments to protect credibility while avoiding the political consequences associated with openly acknowledging failure. The conflict also became part of a much larger global power struggle. The United States maintains deep strategic partnerships with Israel and several Gulf Arab nations, many of which depend heavily on American military support, weapons systems, intelligence sharing, and regional protection. If Iran appeared capable of successfully resisting U.S. pressure over long periods of time, regional allies might begin reconsidering their own security strategies. Some could question whether American protection remains fully reliable in an increasingly unstable world. Meanwhile, major global powers like China and Russia monitored every development very closely. For them, any visible sign of declining American influence could reshape the international balance of power. Geopolitical competition in the 21st century extends far beyond one single conflict. Every regional crisis becomes connected to broader struggles involving trade routes, military influence, energy security, technological competition, and the future structure of global leadership. This meant the confrontation between Iran and the United States was never simply a regional dispute. It became part of a far larger contest over who would shape the future global order. At the same time, modern warfare itself was evolving rapidly. Information became one of the most powerful weapons on Earth. Governments invested enormous resources into shaping wartime narratives, managing media coverage, controlling public messaging, and influencing international perception. Military losses might be minimized. Victories might be amplified. Sensitive intelligence could remain classified for years. Carefully edited footage, official press conferences, and strategic leaks all became part of the information battlefield. But controlling information became far more difficult in the digital age. Satellite imagery, leaked intelligence documents, independent journalists, open-source investigators, and social media users created competing versions of reality almost instantly. Ordinary people could track military movements online, analyze explosion footage, examine maps, and challenge official narratives from thousands of miles away. For the first time in history, governments no longer had complete control over the flow of wartime information. Every conflict became a global debate happening in real time across phones, televisions, and computer screens. In many ways, controlling perception became nearly as important as controlling territory itself. As dramatic music rises and the desert skies darken once again, the reality of modern conflict becomes increasingly clear. Today's wars rarely end with simple declarations of victory or surrender. Instead, they often end in uncertainty, competing narratives, political interpretation, and unresolved tensions that continue for years behind the scenes. For the United States, openly admitting defeat against Iran could risk weakening military credibility, damaging alliances, creating domestic political backlash, destabilizing economic confidence, and reducing global influence at a time when international power balances are already shifting rapidly. That is why powerful nations rarely use the language of defeat, even when strategic objectives remain incomplete or unresolved. Because in modern geopolitics, perception itself is power. And sometimes, controlling the story becomes the final battlefield of all.